The Wilhelm HSTF was established pursuant to President Trump's Inauguration Day executive order, protecting the American people against invasion.
At 2:47 p.m. Eastern Time, the director of the Drug Enforcement Administration stood behind a podium bearing the seal of the United States Department of Justice and delivered words that would echo through cartel boardrooms from Culiacan to Guangzhou. Today, we announced the largest seizure of fentanyl precursor chemicals in American history. Over $500 million in chemical assets. 18 covert laboratory facilities destroyed. 47 arrests spanning 3 countries. And the dismantling of a supply chain that has pumped poison into American communities for nearly a decade. He paused, letting the weight of the numbers settle over the room. This operation did not just disrupt a drug network. It exposed a shadow infrastructure built to ensure that fentanyl would flow into the United States forever. And what our investigators discovered inside these facilities will fundamentally change how we understand the threat we face. But the press conference only told part of the story. What you are about to hear goes deeper. It reveals how a hidden network of laboratories, corrupt officials, and international brokers turned Northern California into the chemical gateway for the deadliest drug crisis in American history. And the deeper we go, the worse it gets. It started at 4:32 a.m. Pacific Time, 3 days before that press conference, in the fog-shrouded industrial sprawl east of Sacramento, where the Central Valley stretches into a landscape of agricultural processing plants, cold storage facilities, and anonymous warehouses that handle everything from almonds to automotive parts. The air was thick and cold. Ground fog rolled across empty parking lots. Sodium lights flickered over loading docks where no trucks waited. In the distance, the low rumble of freight trains blended with the hum of industrial refrigeration units running through the night. But this morning, something was different. At precisely 4:32 a.m., over 300 federal agents from the FBI, DEA, ICE, and Homeland Security investigations moved in coordinated strike formation across 11 separate locations spanning Sacramento, Stockton, Fresno, and the outer reaches of the San Francisco Bay Area. SWAT teams in black tactical gear advanced on warehouses with peeling paint and faded signage. Agricultural supply distributors, chemical wholesalers, food processing consultants, import-export firms specializing in Asian trade goods. To anyone driving past during business hours, these were legitimate operations. Boring, forgettable, invisible, but federal investigators had been watching them for 14 months. At a sprawling industrial complex off Highway 99 near Stockton, agents breached a reinforced loading bay door with hydraulic cutters. Flashbangs erupted in cascades of white light and concussive thunder. Inside, they found something that looked more like a pharmaceutical manufacturing facility than a warehouse. Rows of stainless steel reaction vessels, industrial-grade ventilation systems, precision temperature controls, vacuum filtration equipment, and pallets stacked floor to ceiling with 55-gallon drums bearing labels in Mandarin and English that read industrial dye intermediates and polymer coating compounds. All of it false labeling. What federal agents were actually looking at was a fentanyl precursor superlab, one of the most sophisticated chemical processing facilities ever discovered on American soil. The air inside reeked of solvents. Agents moved quickly through narrow corridors lined with chemical storage racks, their flashlight beams cutting through residual vapor. In a back office hidden behind a false wall of filing cabinets, they found encrypted laptops, shipping manifests tracing chemical loads from ports in Shenzhen and Ningbo, and ledgers written in coded shorthand that would take cryptographers weeks to fully decipher. They also found something that transformed this raid from a major drug bust into a national security crisis. A locked steel cabinet containing personnel files, photographs of individuals in law enforcement uniforms, payment schedules, and an organizational chart showing a network that reached from Chinese chemical manufacturers through California distribution hubs directly into the production infrastructure of the Sinaloa cartel. The operation had a name buried in the file headers: Project Crimson Lotus. And at the center of that organizational chart was a name that made federal agents stop cold: Marcus Whitfield, the Deputy Director of California's Office of Emergency Services. A man with security clearances, access to state disaster response protocols, and oversight of the very logistics networks that moved goods across California during emergencies and routine operations alike. He wasn't just connected to the network. According to the seized files, he was directing it. By 9 a.m., inside an FBI Cyber Forensics Operations Center in San Francisco, analysts were already cracking the encryption on the seized hard drives. The data that emerged painted a picture so calculated and so deeply embedded in legitimate state infrastructure that veteran investigators sat in stunned silence as the web unfolded across their monitors. Project Crimson Lotus was not a drug operation in any traditional sense. It was a supply chain masquerading as legitimate commerce, designed to exploit the complexity of international trade and the vulnerabilities of California's massive agricultural and industrial logistics networks. Shell companies registered in Delaware, the Cayman Islands, and Hong Kong. ghost accounts routing payments through cryptocurrency exchanges and offshore banks in Singapore and the British Virgin Islands. Fake corporations with names like Pacific Basin Chemical Solutions, Golden Valley Agricultural Supply, and Sierra Logistics Partners. All of them fronts. All of them layered so deeply that tracing ownership required subpoenas across 4 continents. But the digital signatures did not lie. Every shipment of precursor chemicals that passed through California ports. Every payment to warehouse operators and trucking contractors. Every falsified customs declaration that allowed containers of poison to enter the country unchallenged. All of it traced back to Marcus Whitfield's encrypted authorization codes. Investigators reconstructed the system piece by piece. Chinese chemical manufacturers, operating in regulatory gray zones where precursor controls were weak or selectively enforced, produced industrial quantities of fentanyl precursors. Compounds like 4-anilino-N-phenethylpiperidine, dethylfentanyl, and synthetic variants designed to evade international watch lists. These chemicals were shipped to California ports labeled as agricultural dyes, food-grade polymers, and industrial cleaning compounds. Once the containers cleared customs, the chemicals entered a distribution network that Whitfield had built over 7 years. Warehouses in the Central Valley, processing facilities disguised as food packaging plants, trucking contractors who moved loads south toward the border or directly into cartel-controlled territories in Sinaloa and Jalisco. The Sinaloa cartel wasn't just a customer, they were partners. Financial records showed joint investments in shell companies, shared logistics infrastructure, and encrypted communication channels that coordinated shipments in real time. Whitfield had turned California's agricultural heartland into a fentanyl precursor superhighway, and he had done it using the very emergency logistics networks he was supposed to be protecting. One DEA analyst reviewing the financial flows put it simply, "This isn't corruption. This is command-level collusion." He didn't just take bribes. He redesigned state systems to serve the cartel, and the operation was just beginning. At 5:15 a.m. the following morning, inside a Joint Task Force Command Center at Travis Air Force Base, over 100 federal agents, military liaisons, and prosecutors stood before a massive digital display. The screen showed a map of California lit up with over 60 red markers, each one representing a location tied to Project Crimson Lotus. Warehouses in the Central Valley, processing facilities near Fresno and Bakersfield, storage units in the Bay Area, trucking yards in Los Angeles, port facilities in Oakland and Long Beach, safe houses where cartel operatives coordinated cross-border shipments. The mission was clear: total eradication. At 6 a.m., the largest coordinated anti-fentanyl precursor operation in California history launched across 12 counties. Over 1,200 federal agents supported by dozens of SWAT teams, Black Hawk helicopters, armored tactical units, and air interdiction assets moved simultaneously on every node of the network. Coast Guard cutters positioned off the California coast intercepted 3 cargo vessels flagged by intelligence analysts. Border Patrol tactical teams established blocking positions on suspected transit routes toward Mexico. DEA strike teams hit a converted fruit processing plant in Madera, where agents found industrial reaction vessels and precursor chemicals stored in refrigerated chambers designed to look like produce coolers. FBI units stormed a luxury estate in the Sacramento suburbs where Whitfield maintained a private residence. Inside, agents discovered encrypted communication systems, falsified state emergency protocols, and financial records showing payments from Sinaloa cartel intermediaries totaling over $12 million. In Stockton, ICE and HSI agents raided a freight forwarding company that had been receiving shipments from China and redistributing them through a network of shell trucking companies. Inside, they found pallets of mislabeled chemical drums, stacks of forged bills of lading, and evidence of coordination with corrupt customs brokers at multiple ports. At the Port of Oakland, agents intercepted 4 shipping containers that intelligence analysis had flagged as high-priority targets. The containers, listed as carrying agricultural equipment and food-grade packaging materials, were cracked open under federal warrant. Inside, 31 tons of precursor chemicals in factory-sealed drums. Enough raw material to produce over 300 million lethal doses of fentanyl. The operation moved with surgical precision, fast, coordinated, unforgiving. By 4 p.m., federal agents had seized over 92 tons of precursor chemicals, dismantled 18 covert labs and storage facilities, arrested 47 individuals including chemical brokers, warehouse operators, trucking contractors, and cartel logistics coordinators, and recovered over $38 million in cash and cryptocurrency assets. They also detained Marcus Whitfield at his Sacramento office, where he was preparing for a routine emergency preparedness meeting with county officials. He did not resist. He did not run. He simply looked at the federal agents, straightened his tie, and said nothing. One FBI supervisor on scene described it this way: "The underworld took more damage in 18 hours than it had in the previous 18 months." But the real shock came when we started reading what was on his computers. As investigators examined the seized servers, encrypted communications, and financial records recovered from Whitfield's properties, they uncovered something that transformed the scope of this case from a supply chain takedown into a systemic corruption investigation. The network did not just rely on anonymity and mislabeling. It relied on infiltration. Deep infiltration. Inside Whitfield's encrypted files, investigators found years of correspondence with individuals working inside California state agencies, port authorities, trucking regulators, and law enforcement organizations. Some were witting accomplices, paid in cash or cryptocurrency to provide advance notice of inspections, alter regulatory schedules, or expedite permits for shell companies that should have faced months of scrutiny. Others were unwitting facilitators, low-level employees who had been socially engineered into processing documents they believed were legitimate emergency protocols or routine logistics adjustments. But the most troubling discovery was evidence of systematic corruption within law enforcement itself. Federal agents identified at least 23 individuals working in roles with access to drug interdiction databases, highway patrol scheduling systems, and port security protocols who had been receiving regular payments from Whitfield's network. These individuals provided advance notice of checkpoints and inspections. They altered patrol schedules to create gaps in coverage when chemical shipments were moving. They leaked intelligence about pending investigations. And in at least 7 documented cases, they directly facilitated the transfer of flagged shipments out of federal holding before they could be examined. One payment ledger recovered from Whitfield's files showed over $4.2 million distributed across this network of compromised officials over a 22-month period. The system was elegant in its corruption. Whitfield paid well. He paid on time. He selected targets who were financially vulnerable or ideologically sympathetic. And he built a system where betrayal was profitable and exposure seemed impossible. When honest officers and state officials were briefed on the scale of the infiltration, some could barely speak. One California highway patrol sergeant who had spent 20 years trying to stop drug trafficking sat in the briefing room with his head in his hands. You spend your whole career believing in the badge, believing that the people next to you are fighting the same fight, and then you find out that some of them were helping the poison flow. It breaks something inside you. Federal prosecutors have now opened parallel investigations into systemic corruption within California state agencies. 12 current and former law enforcement officers face federal charges. 3 Port Authority officials have been indicted. 2 state emergency management coordinators are under investigation. The message from the Justice Department was clear. If you enable this pipeline, knowingly or unknowingly, there will be consequences. The system will be rebuilt, but first, it has to be cleaned. As investigators continued analyzing the full scope of Project Crimson Lotus, one question dominated every briefing room and task force meeting. How far did this go? The answer came in fragments, pieced together from server logs, financial transfers, shipping manifests, and intercepted communications with cartel contacts in Mexico and chemical suppliers in China. What they discovered was devastating. The network was not confined to California. Whitfield's operation had established distribution routes into Nevada, Arizona, Oregon, and as far east as Colorado and New Mexico. Using a combination of legitimate trucking contractors, agricultural transport companies, and cartel-controlled logistics cells, the network moved precursor chemicals in shipments camouflaged as fertilizers, food additives, and industrial cleaning compounds. The chemicals traveled on the same highways as legitimate agricultural goods. They passed through the same way stations. They were handled by the same freight brokers. The volume was so massive and so well disguised that distinguishing poison from produce required intelligence that most enforcement agencies simply did not have. Federal analysts estimate that at peak operation, the network was facilitating the movement of over 6 tons of precursor chemicals per week into cartel production zones in Sinaloa and Jalisco. That volume, when converted into finished fentanyl, represented the chemical foundation for hundreds of millions of counterfeit pills. Each one pressed to look like legitimate oxycodone or Xanax. Each one potentially containing a lethal dose. Each one destined for American streets, American schools, American homes. The supply chain fed the crisis that was killing over 70,000 Americans every year. But the scale did not stop at distribution. Investigators discovered communications showing that Whitfield had been planning expansion, working with intermediaries to establish redundant supply routes through Pacific Northwest ports, exploring partnerships with chemical manufacturers in India and Vietnam in case Chinese regulatory pressure increased, developing synthetic precursor variants that did not yet appear on international watch lists. And buried deep in the seized servers, investigators found a file labeled with a date 18 months in the future. It was a strategic planning document, a blueprint for what Whitfield called Phase 3. The document outlined plans to expand chemical processing capacity within California, to establish additional distribution hubs in agricultural regions across the western United States, to develop relationships with emerging synthetic drug operations in Central America, and to create what the document described as permanent infrastructure that could survive any single enforcement action. The final page of the document contained a single paragraph that investigators have cited in every subsequent briefing. The fentanyl market represents the most profitable opportunity in the history of narcotics trafficking. Demand is permanent, supply is controllable, and the chemicals that enable production can move through legitimate commerce indefinitely if managed correctly. This network is not a temporary operation. It is the foundation of a permanent supply system. One federal prosecutor reviewing the document put it bluntly: he wasn't just feeding the crisis. He was building the infrastructure to ensure it never ends. The final takedown of Marcus Whitfield came quietly. At 7:47 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, FBI agents arrested him as he walked from his car toward the California Office of Emergency Services headquarters in Sacramento. He was dressed in a charcoal suit. He carried a leather briefcase containing a laptop, encrypted USB drives, and documents related to a scheduled meeting on wildfire response protocols. To anyone watching, he looked like any other government official arriving for work. But inside that briefcase, and inside the systems he controlled, was evidence of a conspiracy that had pumped hundreds of millions of dollars worth of poison into American communities. Evidence of corruption that had compromised law enforcement at every level. Evidence of a partnership with cartels that had helped kill tens of thousands of Americans. He is currently being held without bail at a federal detention facility. He faces charges including conspiracy to distribute controlled substance precursors, international money laundering, racketeering, and corruption of public officials. If convicted on all counts, he faces life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. But his arrest is not the end of this story. It is the beginning of a reckoning. Here is what the raids, the forensics, and the arrests revealed. Power does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it wears a government badge. Sometimes it operates from an office in a state capital. Sometimes it hides behind emergency protocols and logistics flowcharts that no one outside a small circle ever reviews. And sometimes the most dangerous people in the drug trade are the ones who never touch the product. They just make sure it flows. The fentanyl crisis is not only about cartels in Mexico or chemical manufacturers in China. It is about enablers, facilitators, brokers who exploit the gaps between international commerce and domestic enforcement, officials who sell their access and their authority for cash, systems designed to move goods efficiently that can be turned into systems designed to move poison invisibly. California, with its massive port infrastructure, its sprawling agricultural logistics networks, and its proximity to the border, became the perfect environment for this kind of operation. The chemicals arrived disguised as legitimate trade goods. They moved through legitimate trucking companies. They were processed in facilities that looked like food plants and chemical wholesalers. And for years, it worked. Chemicals flowed in, fentanyl precursors flowed out, and tens of thousands of Americans died. The counterfeit pills that ended up in high schools and college dorms. The powder that found its way into party drugs and street supplies. The doses that killed teenagers who thought they were taking something else entirely. All of it traced back to supply chains that men like Marcus Whitfield built and protected. This is the cost. Over 70,000 Americans dead every year from fentanyl and synthetic opioids. Families destroyed. Communities hollowed out. Emergency rooms overwhelmed. First responders traumatized by the sheer volume of overdose calls. This is what a chemical supply chain produces when it operates without interruption. But now federal agencies have the blueprint. They know how the chemicals move. They know how the money flows. They know how corrupt officials are recruited and paid. They know how legitimate systems are turned into distribution networks for poison. And they are not stopping. If you are still watching this, tap the like button so more people understand what is really happening in the fentanyl supply chain. Comment expose if you believe this kind of infiltration needs to be dragged into the light and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Because this is not just about one network in California. This is about a system that allowed mass poisoning to become a business model. A system where international chemical manufacturers, corrupt officials, and cartel production networks operate as a single integrated enterprise. A system designed to ensure that fentanyl flows into American communities forever. Unless we confront the full scope of how that system operates, from the factories in China to the warehouses in California to the cartel labs in Mexico, nothing will change. The chemicals will keep coming, the pills will keep spreading, and the deaths will keep rising. The question is whether we are ready to face it.